Okay, so we start. We have already seen the introduction to the Linux. What are the features? That it is an open source operating system, which is similar to your Windows, Mac, Android, and Unix. One of the common thing in Unix and Linux is that both of them have many major commands as similar. So you do not have to learn Linux separate and Unix separate. So if you know either of one operating system commands, you can always use the second operating system. We had seen what is the definition of an operating system, that it is an interface between the user and the hardware of your computer system. So any interaction happens via the operating system. We had seen what are the types of the system: single user and multi-user. We had seen that single user is divided into two types, that is single user performing only single task and a single user performing multiple task. Then we had seen what is multi-user. That means there are more than one users operating on one particular system. We call that scenario as a multi-user system. And this concept of multi-user is being possible with the help of a time slice method and a preemptive method. In time slice, every system is being given an individual time to operate, and the system operates only for that particular amount of time. In preemptive priority, every process is being given with a priority, but if the second process which has arrived has a highest priority, the first process will be stopped and the second process will be starting with its execution. That is what is preemptive. Then we had seen that we have three terminals, terminal A, B, and C. All the three are connected to a central processor, and this scenario was for a multi-user system. So for a system to operate in a multi-user mode, we require the connectivity of a network to one major system, which is a central processor. And the main purpose of multi-user is for sharing a data from a central processor. So this scenario can be based on the time slice method, or it may be operating in a preemptive method. Then we had seen certain features of a multiprocessing operating system. The first feature was multitasking. That means a system can perform more than one task at a time, where many can be running in the background and single can be running in a foreground. Then we have resource sharing. That is, when two computers are involved, one computer can act as a client server where I'm only giving the information, and the other can act as a client, which is a scenario of a client user, client server. And the second can be peer to peer, where the system itself is acting as a client as well as a server. So whenever I share something between any computer systems, I call it as a resource sharing. Then the third one was background processing. The background processing was making multiple processes or a single process running in a background and only one single running in a foreground. So to do this, we have seen that we have to include ampersand sign after a command. So when I write ampersand after a particular command, that process or that particular command starts running in the background, and then you can open any particular program in the foreground. And we had seen different types of multi-user operating system. The first one was distributed operating system. Now again, distributed operating system is that where there are multiple systems connected together, and all the systems are called as node. Now to have this multi-user operating system, I should have one network to connect all the computers. And if I have a distributed scenario, which means the computer should also have a software for that distributed operating system. So I had told you one of the examples for this is your remote access system. That is nothing but you have installed your AnyDesk, or if you have installed any other software which will allow you to share the entire screen or to share the direct resources from the other computer. Then we have seen two types of distributed system, the client server and the peer-to-peer system. If you see client server, these are the systems which act as only the clients sending the request, whereas a server machine is the one which will accept the request and serve back with a reply. Whereas in peer-to-peer, all are connected to every other computer, where everyone can act as a client and every other can act as a server also. Then we had seen what is a time slice system, where every user is being given or every system is being assigned with some particular amount of time, and it has to work only on that particular amount of time. Okay, but it is assumed to the user that there are many processes or many computers that are running together. when the chance of the particular user comes, the link gets activated, and that link is called as an active link. Then we had seen what is a multiprocessor system. Now, multiprocessor system, if you remember, is equal to or is same to your multi-programming system, where again it is assumed to the user that there are multiple programs running, but at the system end or at the CPU end, there is only one program running. Rest all have been gone for the IO resources. So the CPU does not sit idle. If a particular program has gone for any IO resources, it immediately starts the execution of the next process. Then we had seen the difference between single user system and a multi-user system. In single user, a user can perform only one task, whereas in multi-user, I can perform multiple tasks at a time. Then since being executing only single task, it is very simple. Multiple task, it becomes little complex. Then only one user is operating at a time. Here, number of users are accessing the database and accessing many resources at a same time. Then the example of a single user was previously used MS-DOS, but nowadays all the other operating system after MS-DOS are considered to be multi-user operating system. Let they be a desktop operating system or a mobile operating system, all of them are considered to be as a multi-user. Then the time taken to complete the task in a single user is more, as we are performing only single task, whereas in multi-user the time taken is little more, as there are multiple tasks getting executed at a same time. Then we had seen a few advantages of multi-user operating system. System efficiency. How is the efficiency of a system being utilized or is more? Because since we are executing more tasks, the CPU never sits idle and it keeps on executing one or the other task. So the efficiency of the system increases as the performance of the CPU increases. Then the different user can access to a same document on a same computer at the same time. So since I have maintained a central processor to which all the other systems are getting connected, so every computer can access to a same document from a central processor at the same time. None of the users have to wait for any other user to complete a task or complete the execution on the same document. Then we had also seen certain disadvantages, that is data sharing and virus attack. Now, since to operate in this multi-user system, we require a network. So wherever there is a network connectivity, always there is going to be some or the other kind of virus attack if we do not take any kind of precautions or if we do not take any kind of security measures. Now, what were those security measures like antiviruses or firewalls? We'll be seeing that more in detail further. So we had done up till here. Today we'll be starting with the characteristics of a Linux operating system. So we have seen that Linux operating system is a multi-user operating system. It is an open source operating system. Then it is similar, or its commands are similar to the Unix. Now some other features that are, or some another characteristics that a Linux has. First is the multitasking. So we all know what is multitasking. Performing more than one task can be done in a Linux operating system. Therefore, it is considered to be as a multitasking operating system. Now, same multitasking can be done if it is your Android operating system. It can be done if it is your Windows operating system. It can also be done with all the versions of Linux operating system. So it is not necessary that it is only supported by the version number 14 and not by 15 or not by 16. It is supported by all the versions starting from the first version until all the updates. Now again, same goes with the multi-user. Multiple users can be connected in a Linux operating system and the sharing of the documents and the data can be done. Again, this is applicable for all the versions of the Linux operating system. Next is portability. Now, what is portability? It means that it is not necessary that it will be installed only with a minimum hardware requirements. It can be installed with the ranging from minimum to maximum. That means if you have RAM of 2 GB or 4 GB, your Linux will be installed. If you have a RAM of 8 GB or 16 GB, your Linux can be installed. So it is not back forth compatible with the hardware or a front end compatible, which means what? It does not see what is the hardware or what kind of software it is or which model of a computer it is. It can be installed on any model with minimum RAM requirements. Now, what will be that minimum RAM requirements? That will be seeing in the installation part. So if you have that minimum, it will be installed very properly into your system, and it will operate with all the features and all the characteristics. That is what is portability. So it is not system dependent. That means it is not system specific. It can be installed on any kind of a system. So if it won't even distinguish between laptop and your desktop. It can be installed on your desktop PCs also, as well as on your laptop also. Next is the security. So security is also one of the feature of your Linux operating system. Now, what are those 3 steps of security that we'll be seeing in the next slide? Then next is communication. So you can always have a network communication in your Linux operating system. That means your Linux can communicate with your Windows, Linux can communicate with your Android, Linux can communicate with any other version of your Windows, or it can be communicating with any other operating system. But only one requirement for that communication has to be the network. So if you have that network connectivity, it is possible to communicate any kind of data with any kind of system. Next is graphical user interface. Now, what is graphical user interface? You are not going to operate with a command, but you will be operating with the icons, menus, windows with your system. So previously, the previous versions of the Linux were only based on the commands. That means if you want to operate anything, you should first by heart, or you should first know those commands. If you know the commands, you will be able to operate. But if you do not know the commands, you have to first learn them. So this was the previous version disadvantages. But nowadays, whatever versions of Linux we have, all the versions are both command supported as well as GUI. That means you can click on any buttons, you can click on any icons, you have same windows to make your work easy. That is what is graphical user interface. Then next is supports customized keyboards. Supports customized keyboard means it is not necessary that it will support only your standard keyboard. Now, what is standard keyboard? The one which you have in front of you, having some alphabets, numbers, function keys, control keys, then shift key, enter key. It will also support a keyboard which is made for gaming. It will also support a keyboard which is made for your internet facility. It will also support the ergonomic keyboards. That means apart from standard keyboards, you bring any other keyboard and you install, the operating system, which is Linux, will be able to take an input from that particular keyboard also. Therefore, it is called as supports customized keyboard. So not only standard, but it can be used with all the other types of keyboards to accept the input. Next is the file system. Now, everything inside a Linux is considered to be as a files. Now, what do we have in our Windows? We have a drives, C, D, E, F. All the drive have certain folders, and inside folders, we have individual files. So how is a hierarchy in the Windows? We have drive, we have files, and then, we have drive, we have folders, and then we have files. Whereas in Linux, we will have the folders, but we will not call them as a folders. We call that folders also as a file. So your Linux entirely is called as a file-based operating system. We do not have any kind of a folders, or we do not call it as a folders. After we have a drive, or after the partition is done, the next thing or the next level is the file level. We do not have a folder level. So Linux is a file-based operating system. And why it is file-based? Because everything inside the system is called to be as a file. Last is the open source. So it can be downloaded freely by any of the website. So you do not have to purchase any license, or you do not have to pay anything to take that operating system. You can easily download it at free of cost. So these are the 9 characteristics of your Linux operating system. It can be asked for 3 marks in only to list down in your exams, or it may be asked to explain 2 or 3 for your 6 marks or 4 marks. Okay. So now we have seen that there's one of the feature called as security. Now, what 3 level of security is being provided by your Linux? That will be seen here. First level is authentication, then we have authorization, and then we have encryption. Now, what is authentication? A person or a user is asked with a password. If a valid password has been provided, the user is allowed to use the system. That is what is called as authentication. So if I want to use my Gmail account, what do I have to give after I type my ID? I have to give my password. So that procedure is called as authentication. If you want to log in into your Facebook, again, it will ask you for ID. It will ask you for the password. So any application or any system which asks you for the ID and the password is called as authentication based application. If you give that proper password, you will be allowed to use the application. But if you provide incorrect password, it will give you 2 to 3 attempts. If you are failed in that attempt, it will lock the account. Once the account is being locked, you have to go to the admin of that particular account and ask it to open or give you the alternative password. That is what is called as authentication. So if you see, it is claiming a person whom you are by assigning the password and the login names, ensuring that nobody can gain access to their work. But what will be the disadvantage of this authentication? Once if my password is being known by any other method to some another person, that person can use that password to log in inside my system. You might come to a word when you learn the subject system security as shoulder surfing. Now, what is this shoulder surfing? Previously, everyone did not have a network connection at home. We used to go to the cyber cafes and we used to do that internet work over there. So what was happening in the cyber cafes? Some of the cyber cafes were very professional, individual rooms were given, but it was not with all. Just a small table without any participation, without any partition. So if I'm standing behind you and if I'm observing your password while you are typing, that is what is called as password shoulder surfing. That means I am standing behind your shoulder and I'm observing what password you are typing. And once if I get to know that password, I can use that password to log in into the account. So that is one of the disadvantage of your authentication based security. So if I shoulder surf and if I get to know your password, I can easily log in into your account and use your account. There are always certain kind of prevention measures here also, that if you're using the password or your account in some cyber cafes, see to it that you log out after you have used that, or you immediately change the password before you step out of that cyber cafe. So even if the shoulder surfing has happened, that other person cannot use your account. Why? Because you have already changed the password before you went out of that cyber cafe. Okay. Next level of security is authorization. Now, what is this authorization? If you see, it is at a file level. Now, as I said, that Linux is a file-based operating system. Everything in your Linux is considered to be as a file. Now, there are certain types of restrictions given on those files. Now, the restrictions which are applied on those files are called as authorization. Same restrictions are there on your Windows also. If you click on any of the file and if you go to the properties and if you go to the security tab of that, you can observe that it is read, write, owner, allow, deny, something like this is being shown to you. Now, what is that? It is nothing but the file level authorization. I will show you on my system for one of the files. So if you see, I have a file, I have a folder on my desktop which is written as Jane documents. Okay. So when I right click to it and when I go to the security tab, I get to see this permissions. What are those permissions? Full control, allow, modify, allow, read and execute, allowed, list of folder contents, allowed, read, allowed, write, allow. So what are these? These are all the authorization with respect to a particular file. Now, if you see in Windows, by default, it is allowed. Why? Because I am only the admin of the system. I am only the user of the system. So since I am the admin, for me, everything will be allowed. But if I create a one more user, which is not an admin, there might be some kind of restrictions with respect to these particular files. So it may be deny for write. So if I have a deny over here for a write, which means what? I can only view this particular folder, but I cannot make any changes inside the files of these particular folders. So for admin user into Windows, everything is allowed by default. For the user, it might change if the admin has made such kind of settings. But into Linux, but if you see into Linux, what is happening into Linux? I have to change this permission by making use of the commands. What permissions do I have inside a file, inside a Linux? Only 3 permissions. In Windows, you saw there are many: full control, modify, read, write, file, folder contents, etc. Whereas in Linux, since everything is file, we have only 3 options. It is either read, write, or execute. We have seen this in operating system. They are termed as R, W, and X or EX, where R stands for read, W stands for write, and EX, that is, or X only stands for execute. So every file inside your Linux operating system will have this 3 kind of authorization. I can change this authorization by using a command called as chmod. chmod. So when I use this command, I can change the modification of the particular file from read to write, or from read to execute, or from write to read, or write to execute, or any particular thing. So that is what is called as authorization. So when I talk about authorization, it is nothing but changing the read, write, and execute permission for a particular file. So if I am a owner of a file, I will have read, write, and execute all the 3 permissions. Why? Because I have created the file. But when I share this file with any one of you, I might change that authorization by using a chmod to only read. So when I send this file to you, you won't be able to edit that, but you will be only able to view the contents. You cannot write, you can neither execute. Again, if I make you owner of a same file, you can also read, you can also write, you can also execute. Okay, so to the owner, by default, all the 3 permissions are given. No need to change. But when the owner is sending it to any other user, it can change the permission from read to write, or it can change it to any particular field, either read, write, or execute, by using a chmod command. So that is what is called as authorization. So when it is at application level, we have authentication. When it is at file level, we have authorization. The third one is encryption. Now it is encryption. This makes a particular file in an unreadable format. Now what is happening in authorization? If I have my system opened, I have logged in inside my system, I have made a particular file, and I am the owner. Okay, for some time I have left the system. You might come, you might make yourself as a owner, and you transfer the file. So what is happening now? You are also having the owner rights. I am also having the owner rights. But I am not aware that you have come behind me and you have made these changes. Okay, so to avoid this authentication problem, that is a password level problem, and the authorization level problem, you have one of the best security measures, which is called as encryption. Now, what is that encryption? It will make that file in an unreadable format. So if I am a sender, and if, say, suppose Huzefa is a receiver, if I am sending this file to a Huzefa, what will I do? I will encrypt that file. The method of encryption is called as encrypt. Now you have different types of encryption. This also you'll study in the subject system security. But for now, just remember, one type of encryption is called as ciphertext, which means what? I am going to make that file in an unreadable format by using an algorithm called as ciphertext. Okay, this algorithm you will study later. So the name of the algorithm to change the data in an unreadable format is an algorithm called as ciphertext. So I will just run that algorithm, put my file into it. That file will be converted into an encrypted form. Then I will send that encrypted file to the receiver. That is true, I will send it to the Huzefa. What will Huzefa do? Huzefa will use its particular key. Now there are 2 types of key over here, public key and private key. Now what is public key? Which means it is given to anybody. So if I want to share something in the classroom, so what will I do? I will share that document with a public key, so that every one of you is going to use that same public key, and it will access the data. Public key means, say, suppose it is 123. So you will type that public key as 123 and access the data. But if I want to send something in private, which should not be known to anybody else, in that case, I will make use of private key. So what am I doing? I'm sending a data with a private key to Huzefa. Now that private key is known only to the Huzefa. So Huzefa will use that private key and extract the data. Now, even if that file unknowingly has reached to Darshil also, but there I have not sent a private key to Darshil. So what will happen? Darshil will not be able to extract the file. So the person who has a private key can only extract the file. That is what is called as encryption. So when the file is extracted by using that private key, it will be converted back into the readable form. So unless and until the private key is not being given, the file will not be converted into the readable form. That is what is called as method of encryption by using an algorithm called as ciphertext, which uses a public key and a private key concept. If it is public key, it is shared with everybody and everybody can access. But if it is sent only confidentially to one particular person, I also have to share a private key with him. And if that private key is inserted, then only the data will be converted back into the readable form. That is what is called as encryption. So you have three security that is being used by your Linux operating system. One is authentication, second is authorization, and the third is encryption. Authentication at the application levels, authorization at file levels, and encryption can be used in with any of these files in with the authorization. So in encryption, I can combine authorization also, but I cannot use this encryption with authentication. Okay. So these are the three types of security concepts into your Linux. Now next we go to the structure of Linux operating system. Now we have seen the structure of a normal operating system. Operating system is located into the center, surrounded by your users and the hardware. We have also seen some of the terms of the operating system like kernel. Now we have this kernel into your Linux operating system also. So what is the structure of your Linux system? It has different components. Which are those components? First is kernel, then you have system libraries, you have system tools, you have development tools, and you have end users tool. So we'll be seeing each and every component. So the first part will be the kernel. Now we know that operating system is situated in the center, and above to it we have software and below to it we have user. Now what is happening between the communication from user to software? It has to go via operating system. Any communication from software to the user also has to go via operating system. So inside this operating system, we have one core component or one very essential component called as kernel. Now this kernel performs many different types of activities. What are those activities that we'll see? Now if you see at this diagram, we have process 1, 2, and 3. What is this process 1, 2, and 3? It is nothing but the software. What is this hardware resource? It is nothing but the hardware which a user is going to use. So once the user gives the input, I will require a hardware resource to give that input. What input a user is giving through that hardware? To execute some of the other processes. Now what is happening in between this? It is the communication or it is a work of the operating system. But which part of the operating system? The kernel part. So what is kernel doing over here? All the requests of hardware and software are managed by this kernel. If you see this process 1, 2, and 3, what is it? It is a request that has come from the user to execute process 1, process 2, process 3. So the execution of each and every process and making the hardware resources available to that particular process is done by whom? Is done by the kernel. Many a time we have seen that in multi-programming operating system, we have two processes, P1 and P2. P1 has started the execution, but in between the execution, it wants some IO device. So who is going to take care about the request of that IO device and giving the reply back to that IO device is nothing but the kernel. Once that request and response is being completed, again, it will be taken over by the operating system. So the work of the kernel is only to take all the IO requests. After the IO requests are be taken, search that which IO request that process wants and give that IO request back to the process. So the communication between the processes and the hardware devices is done by your intermediate part or the core part of your operating system, which is kernel. Okay, so if you see, it establishes the communication between the devices and the software. What is that software? Nothing but the user request or the user processes which the user wants to execute. And what are the devices? All the hardware devices that some or all process may require to complete its execution. Apart from this, it is also going to manage all the other system resources. So it has some responsibilities. What are those responsibilities? First is memory management, device management, process management, and system calls. Now, what is happening? User first is a memory management. What is memory management? To see whether the amount of memory is free to allocate that particular resource or not. If that memory is not free, it might get stored into a hard disk. If that memory is, you have seen there are three types of memory: cache memory, your primary, which is RAM, and a secondary memory, which is hard disk. So what is memory management doing? It is going to check to store the data into either of three. First, it will be checking in the cache. If not, it will be checking in the RAM. If not, it will be checking in the hard disk. If not all these three, then it will go to the virtual memory. So who is going to manage this entire memory part? It will be managed by your kernel. Okay. So it will check with whether there is a space in the cache memory. If not, it will check in the primary memory. If not, again, it will check in the hard disk. So for doing this, it might use some memory management concepts like paging and segmentation. That also we know. If the memory space is there, it might divide it into a concept of paging, where the entire memory blocks are divided into pages and then the data are stored into page. Then to extract that pages, we make use of a concept called as demand paging. Only bring those pages into the main memory which are required. Do not bring all the pages. So all those concept is being looked after by whom? It is being looked after by the kernel. We say that it is being looked after by CPU, but it is not by the CPU. It is by the part of the operating system, which is kernel. Then we have device management. Now, what is device management? Which particular process requires which kind of device, which IO device is required, how to give them that particular device is being done by the kernel. That is what is called as device management. Give that device, give the attributes of the device, take away those attributes from the device. All this thing is done by the kernel. Then we have process management. Now, when I say device management, the request is coming for this device from whom? It is coming from the processes. So again, looking after each and every process, looking for each and every request coming from that process is also done by the kernel. If you remember, we had seen one diagram. There are two modes in which the operating system operates. One is a user mode and another is a kernel mode. So once a request is being given by the user to the system, it switches from a user mode to the kernel mode. When it is shifting into a kernel mode, what are the activities that a kernel is doing? These are the activities: memory management, device management, process management, executing the processes, generating the results, checking for the system calls and all. Once if one display is being given of a result to the user, it will again switch from a kernel mode to the user mode. Again, a user will give a second request for executing. Again, it will switch from user mode to a kernel mode. So this will keep on happening until the request keeps on coming. So what is a function of a user mode is just to give a request for the execution. But what is a work at the kernel mode is memory management, device management, process management, and system calls. Now, what is system calls? This also we are aware of. Who is giving you the request? A user is giving the request. Where the request has to go, the request has to reach to the kernel. If the request does not reach to the kernel, it can neither manage the memory nor the devices nor the process. So shifting of data or taking the data from a user and making it available to the kernel is done by the system calls. We had seen there are many different types of system calls. System calls related to process, system call related to files, system call related to devices. What were the system call related to process? Creating the process, executing the process, terminating the process. These were the system calls. So once a request has given by the user to execute a particular process, it will use a system call called as create process. Where will that create process system call will be given? It will be given to the kernel. Kernel will enter into a process management. It will create that process. After the process is being created, it will see whether it does it require any device. If the device is required, it will use a system called as get device. The device will be given. After the device work is being completed, it will take back the device. It will start the execution of a process. So again, what system call will be required? Execute process system call will be required. So what is a system call? It is nothing but taking the data or taking a request from the user and making it available to the kernel. So the communication between the user and the kernel can be done with the help of the different system calls. And what are the responsibility of this kernel is to look after the process, the devices of the process, and the memory management. Okay, so with this, we had seen what is the kernel part. So the kernel, which is a middle layer, what is that kernel doing? It is doing 4 other work at together. What are those four other works? Memory, device, process, and system calls. Next, we'll be seeing next component is the system library. Now, what is system library? They are nothing but a special program that helps in accessing the kernel features. Now, if I have written a program, now many a times, if you write a Java program, you import certain libraries. Now, why are those library support required? In order to execute that program and to generate the output. Import certain interfaces, import certain mathematical libraries, import certain application libraries. Why are those things required? To make your application or to make your program work, you require those special kind of libraries. Now, if I'm designing a calculator, I might require certain mathematical libraries. So if I do not import those libraries, some of the mathematical calculation might not work. But once if I import them, I might get the output. So such kind of libraries which are required for your system kernel to work are called as system libraries. So they are by default there inside the system. You do not have to create those libraries. You just have to use them for the application which you want to execute. Okay. So the such kind of libraries which will make your kernel work are called as system libraries. And why again they are called as system libraries? Because they are part of your kernel and the kernel is a core part of your system. Therefore, it is called as kernel executing or accessing a kernel feature or system libraries. A kernel has to be triggered in order to perform any particular task, and this triggering is done by the application. Now, I've written an application by using some C language in my Linux program or in my Linux operating system. Now, when I give this application to a system for the execution, what will happen? System calls will be executed and then your kernel will be activated. So to make that kernel activate, what I have to do is I have to import those system libraries. So those system libraries are by default there inside your system. Again, where they are inside your operating system only. So the system libraries are not supposed to be written anywhere in the program. They will automatically get activated once your kernel is activated. Okay. Programmers have developed the standard libraries of procedures to communicate with kernel. Programmers means the manufacturers have already written these standard libraries. And you do not have to write it on your own or you do not have to develop it on your own. But what are those system libraries which will ask the kernel to work? Such kind of libraries are called as system libraries. Again, where they are inside your operating system only. You do not have to use it in your program. Once your program reaches by the system call to the kernel, they are automatically getting activated. That is what is system library. Next we have is system tools. Now what are system tools? A Linux operating system has a set of utility tools which are usually simple commands. With the help of these commands, you can access your files, you can edit them, you can manipulate them, you can change the location, etc. Now, how I already said that Linux is a command operating system as well as a GUI operating system. That means I can use the GUI functions also, as well as I can use the commands. But to use those commands, I should know that commands. So whichever commands I use to open the file, to edit that file, to write inside that file, to change the owner of the file, to change the location of the file. All these commands are nothing but called as a system tools. Okay, so each and every command inside your Linux operating system are not called as commands, but they are called as system tools. Okay, so I can use Linux operating system as a GUI or as a system tool. So what is that system tool? Is nothing but using the system with the help of the commands. So I have commands to play each and every action inside my operating system. But the only thing is I should know the commands before I use. Where are all those commands? All those commands are inside the system tools. Okay. So system libraries are used to activate your kernel to function. System tools are the commands which a user used to perform certain kind of action. Next we have is development tools. What are development tools? With the above three components, your operating system is running and working. So if I have system libraries, if I have system tools, and if I have a kernel, my system is going to work. How it will work? I will use those system tools to give commands. System libraries will activate the kernel, and then whatever input I have given, the kernel is going to use all its responsibilities like memory management, device management, and process management to generate and give me the output. Now what is next that we are going to see is development tools. To update your system, you have additional tools and libraries. So every time you might see that there is an update coming for an operating system. What is that update? It is either additional features into the same version, or there is completely a new version. So if right now I'm using Linux 14.1, I might get some update on the features of 14.1, or I might get a new operating system version which is 14.2. Now to change to or to make these updates coming into your operating system, I require certain additional libraries. From where will I get those libraries? I will get it with the help of development tools. Now if I am installing an entire new version, shifting from 14.1 to 14.2, I do not have to install a separate library for development tools. Why? Because since my operating system version is only changing, so I will get the development tools there only. But if there are certain updates in the application of a current version, and if I want those updates of current version, what I have to do is I have to install the development tools which will support that particular versions. Okay. What are those development tools that are related with the new updates on the new features that you are doing on your current version? So if you are changing in the current version, you will require these development tools to be installed separately in your system. But if you are changing from one version to another version, and if you download that version, you do not have to download these tools separately. It will come in that version only, because every time you change, that updates are automatically there into the new version. So if I'm shifting from Android M to Android N, I will have everything of M into N. I do not have to install it separately. But if I want something new into that version M, what I have to do is I have to install it separately. So same thing is there in your Linux also. If you want something extra in the current version, you simply download the development tool. Everything new will be there inside that particular version also. That is what is development tool. So that is not compulsory if you want your system to work. That will be specific to a particular application that a user is using. Next we have is the end user tools. What are end user tools? These tools make a system unique for a user. For example, it may be a graphic design tool, office tool, browser, multimedia player, etc. So whatever applications I install in my system, all those applications are called as end user tools. Now it is not necessary the applications which I install are similar to the ones which you have in your system. So these are specific to a user and they are unique to a user. I might install graphic design, whereas you might not install that. So that becomes specific to me. So what is end user tools? Whatever extra applications that you are installing as per the user needs are considered to be as a end user tool. If I want to install a PDF, Adobe PDF, what is that Adobe PDF? It is nothing but the end user tool. You might not install that because you do not use that, or you might not require that. So that such kind of examples are considered to be as a end user tools. So this is also an optional part. You install it when it is required. Okay, so we have seen what are the different components or structure of a Linux operating system, out of which 1, 2, 3 are compulsory. If you do not have any of these three, your system will not work. Fourth and fifth are optional. It might keep on changing depending upon the user. You require kernel for all the execution. Therefore, it is considered to be as core of operating system. You will require system libraries to activate this kernel to function, and you will require system tools, that is again commands, to make your system work. Again, if you are using GUI, you might not require the system tools also. But if you want to use some applications through commands and just to check, you also require system tools. What are development tools? For additional updates or additional inputs, you require development tools. And what are end user tools? That keeps on changing depending upon the user. Whatever user is installing any kind of application, that is considered to be as a end user tool. Okay, so this is the structure of your Linux operating system. Is this clear up till here? Yash Kulkarni?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Huzefa?
Yes, ma'am.
Ali, clear?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so with this we have seen what are the characteristics of Linux. We have also seen what is the structure of a Linux. Again, both the question mark, you can write it somewhere that they are very important from the end exam point of view. Okay, so when the diagram comes to be drawn for the structure, not for the structure, but for the kernel, you have to draw this diagram. Okay, that you have a kernel as a middle layer. On top, you have user request in the form of a processes, and then you have hardware resources. Then next we'll see what is the difference in Unix and Linux. Now, as I said, if you know one of the commands, you can use the other operating system also. But not everything is similar. It is only restricted up to commands. What are the difference that we'll see now? A Linux is an open source operating system. What is open source? That means it is freely available. You can download it from anywhere. But what is a Unix? It can be used with a copyright version. It can be used by the copywriters. Copywriters means someone has developed it, and whenever you want to install it, you have to purchase from those copywriters. Those copywriters will be available on the internet also. You just have to pay them, and then you have to use it on your system. So that is a difference. So one is open source and other is not open source. You have to take it from the copywriters. What are the examples of Linux? You have Ubuntu, you have Red Hat, you have Fedora. These are the versions or the different kinds of operating Linux operating system. Whereas what are the different types of Unix operating system? It is IBM, HP, UX, Sun Solaris. All these are the different types of Unix operating system. What are users? Nowadays, Linux is in great demand. Anyone can use Linux, whether a home user or a developer or a student. It is developed mainly for the servers, workstations, and the mainframes. So if you see, if you are a normal home user or a student or a developer, it is much more preferable to use Linux. But if I have a system which I have made it as a server, that server will have which operating system? A Unix operating system. So it is generally used for a server-based computer system, whereas this can be used for the client-based operating system. That means you can have it in your labs, we can have it on your personal computers, we can have it on the server also. But for home usage, for personal usage, for development usage, Linux is preferable. But for only server-based system, Unix is much more preferable as compared to Linux. Now, if you come at the cost, Linux is free. Your Unix, you have to pay some amount to get that operating system into your own computer. What is development? As it is an open source, it is developed by sharing and collaboration of codes by worldwide developers. Whereas in Unix, it is developed in some lab. What is that lab? It is called, the name of that lab is AT&T lab, where commercial vendors and non-profit organizations have come together. Now, what does this difference mean is, in a Linux, a group of people have come together. If suppose 5 of us have come together, you know some part of OS development. I know some part of OS development, and similarly, the other 5 people are also know. So we 5 have come together and we have developed this. Now, what will happen is, since it is free of course, since it is freely available, I might include some another person in my community, share that code with him, and that person can do the further update also. But to bring that person or to give that person my code, I have to include them in my community. Okay, that is what that community is called as worldwide developers community. That means they are nothing but the manufacturers. I cannot give operating system code to anybody. I have to include them into this organization, and then only I can share with them. But whereas what is happening in Unix, you have a fixed place where you have to go and you have to develop that operating system. And which is that fixed place? It is a place that is AT&T lab. You cannot include anybody into that organization, and you can give the code or you can share the code and ask them to update and make it available in the market. You can do that, but to do that you have to make them sit and do everything in that lab only. Whereas in Linux it is not like that. You can just include them in the community, and you can ask them to do it from anywhere and make it available again in the free of cost. Whereas in Unix, I have to make them come to that place, give them a code, ask them to do additional work into that, and again make that thing available based on the purchase. Okay, that is what is the development. Then in GUI, again, both of them can be operated with GUI as well as with OS, with the commands. But Unix was previously only command based. Nowadays you have GUI version, but previously it was only command based, whereas Linux was only the few version, that is hardly 1 or 2 version was command. Then it was followed everything by GUI. Now it is the interface. The default interface is the bash, which I had told you. What is that? Nothing but a terminal. Your command prompt is called as terminal or a shell terminal in your Linux operating system. And the shell which is made available to the user is called as a bash shell. That is nothing but the interface. So using that interface, a user can type a command and execute. Whereas in Unix, the shell made available to the users is the Bourne shell. Okay. Next is file system support. Linux supports more file system than Unix. It supports file system, but that which are lesser than Linux. Now, which are those file system that we'll see in the upcoming slides. So both of them are file-based operating system or a file support operating system, but the file system in Linux are more as compared to file system in Unix. So this was the difference between Linux and Unix. So we'll be continuing Linux file system in the next lecture. We'll just take an overview that what is a file system. Now, if we open our Windows operating system and if we go to C drive, what we get to see is C, D, E, F, some kind of letters. What are those letters? They are nothing but the different partitions. If we open any one of the partitions, we get to see some folders. If we open that folders, we get to see some files. Now we have one slot or one partition fixed, which is for the operating system, and the other partitions are free for the user files and folders. Generally, C drive or a C letter is given for operating system. But if you want, you can change it to D or E drive also. But this is done when you partition your hard disk. Kabhi bhi utke you cannot do. You just have, whenever you partition the hard disk, you just have to see that you change the letter from C to D or E, whichever letter you want. But you have to keep one drive specific for the operating system, and the remaining partitions you can keep free for your user and your other kind of application. So what is that partition? From the entire amount of hard disk, say suppose if your hard disk is of 500 GB, what am I doing with that 500 GB is I am dividing that 500 GB into some slots, where I am giving major slot to operating system, then followed by some smaller chunks to the user. This is how is your system if it is Windows operating system. But when I come to a Linux operating system, I will not find any of the C, D, E, F drives. When I open, I will not find any folders like ABC, PQR, XYZ, anything like that. When I open the folders, I will find some files. Whereas in Linux, you will find something like this: /bin/ it is boot /dav /etc/home/lib/root/tmp/user/var. What are these? These are nothing but the file system of your Linux. When I open this file bin, I will get to see more some files. When I open this boot file, I will get to see another some files inside boot. When I open this /dav, I will get to see more some files. So if you observe, I am not calling this bin folder, I am calling it as a bin file. Why? Because everything inside your Linux is a file. You do not have folders. So this bin is a file. You have boot file, dev file, etc file, home file, library file, root file, temp file. Inside this you have sub files. Okay, so you can consider these as the folders into your Windows operating system. But when I talk of Linux, it is also a file. Now if I have some data, say suppose if the text file is tyco Linux attendance, this is a file that I have created. Now this file can be kept into any of the folder if it is Windows operating system. When I open that folder, I will get to see that file. So I have created a folder called as ty computer attendance, and when I open that folder, I will get to see a file tyco lan attendance. Now how is this file and folder stored? It is stored in your memory. Which is that memory? It may be your RAM, it may be your hard disk. But when I execute this, if you remember, to execute any file, that file has to be brought inside your main memory. Which is your main memory? It is a RAM. So even if your folder tyco computer is in your hard disk, it will be first brought inside the RAM for its execution. Now how is it stored? It is stored in the form of a blocks. Every file inside your system is stored in the form of a block. Again, that block concept is there in the Linux also. So if I have a file tyco lan attendance, where is that file stored? It is stored in the Linux, but in what form? In the form of a blocks. Now you have seen how we have to extract the data or how it is being stored. Do you remember contiguous allocation, linked list allocation, and index allocation? The file allocation methods. If it is continuous, means what? Continuous block में data store होगा. First it will get stored in block number 1. If the file is still extra, it will get stored in block number 2, then in block number 3, then in 4, 5, and so on. Why? Because it is continuous. If it is linked list, means what? I will store it in 1, but in 2 I already have some data, so I cannot store it in 2. I have to store it in 3, but I have to give a link from 1 to 3. Do you remember this, Ali?
नहीं मैम.
File allocation operating system में पढ़ा नहीं था? Video which I had shared you.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Acha.
Yes,
if
ma'am.
you have not studied, go to your operating system class. I have made a video on this file allocation, and do see this video. It will be very important for you to understand this concept. If
Okay,
not, I
ma'am.
will again start it in the next lecture. So what is happening in continuous? Continuously data store होगा. What is happening in linked list? Continuous store नहीं होगा. जिधर जगह है उधर store होगा. But how will I extract? I will extract with the help of those links. एक के बाद लिंक किधर है? थर्ड पे. थर्ड के बाद लिंक किधर है? 10 पे. So I have to look at those arrows and I have to go and extract the file. So what is this happening? The same allocation or the same procedure is there into your Linux operating system also. The data is stored in the blocks, and those blocks can be extracted or can be stored in the form of continuous manner or linked list manner or a index manner. But what is stored inside these folders and files is the user data. What are those data in the form of files? Which are those files? It can be a bin file, boot file, etc file, home file, root, temporary, and so on. So what are all these into detail that we will see in the next lecture. Until then, if you have not seen that file allocation method, please go and check that video in the operating system class. If still you don't understand, I will revise that video in the next lecture. Okay. I am taking the attendance. Wait until then. Okay. Done. So what we have done today is we have seen the characteristics of the Linux. We have seen what are the components of our Linux operating system, which is kernel. system tools, system libraries, development tools, and end user tools. And then we have seen the difference between Unix and Linux. And we just started with the file system of the Linux. Everything in file is called as file system. Everything is in the form of files. The data stored in the files is in the form of blocks. We can access that block and store the data in the block in three manner, either continuously or in the form of linked list or in the form of a index. Okay, any doubts?
No, ma'am.
No? Okay, so
No.
Friday is the lecture, no? Again? Thursday, sorry. So I'll make the link available Thursday morning. Okay? No doubts, is the today's lecture clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, your leave. We'll see you on next coming Thursday.